These are the declassified FBI files that reveal how the FBI and CIA waged a decades-long secret war against rock and roll musicians. From jazz legends like Billie Holiday to rock icons like John Lennon and hip-hop pioneers like N.W.A., America's intelligence agencies spent enormous resources surveilling, harassing, and attempting to silence the voices that shaped popular culture. What you're about to discover isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented fact, pulled directly from FBI files, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, and decades of legal battles. The evidence shows a systematic campaign that began in the 1930s and continues to influence how the government monitors artists today. The story begins with a man whose paranoia would define American domestic surveillance for nearly half a century, J. Edgar Hoover. As FBI director from 1924 to 1972, Hoover built an intelligence apparatus that viewed popular music not as entertainment, but as a threat to national security. In his mind, musicians weren't just entertainers, they were potential subversives whose influence over young Americans made them dangerous enemies of the state. Hoover's weapon of choice was COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, launched in 1956. Initially designed to target the Communist Party, COINTELPRO quickly expanded its scope to include civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and crucially, musicians. The program's stated goal was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, or otherwise neutralize groups deemed subversive. What that meant in practice was surveillance, infiltration, harassment, and character assassination. The full scope of COINTELPRO's abuses wouldn't be exposed until 1975, when the Church Committee led by Senator Frank Church investigated FBI overreach and revealed the systematic targeting of American citizens. But music had been on the government's radar long before COINTELPRO officially began. In the 1930s, Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was already targeting jazz musicians. Anslinger believed that jazz, with its African-American origins and association with drug culture, represented a moral threat to white America. His campaign would focus particularly on those musicians who dared to address social issues in their work, including Paul Robeson, the renowned singer and actor whose communist sympathies made him one of the most heavily surveilled entertainers of the pre-COINTELPRO era. The first major target was Billie Holiday. In 1939, Holiday began performing Strange Fruit, a haunting anti-lynching song that exposed the brutal reality of racial violence in the American South. The song's stark imagery and political message made Holiday an immediate target. While there's debate about whether Anslinger specifically targeted Holiday because of Strange Fruit, what's certain is that she faced relentless persecution from federal narcotics agents. She was imprisoned for a year in 1947 on drug charges, and when she was released, her cabaret license was revoked, effectively ending her ability to perform in New York City clubs. In a cruel final act, federal agents arrested Holiday and handcuffed her to her hospital bed as she lay dying in 1959. The government's interest in musicians intensified during the Cold War era. Duke Ellington found himself under FBI surveillance starting in 1938 after performing at the All Harlem Youth Conference, which the FBI labeled a communist front despite President Roosevelt's support for the event. The mere act of performing at benefits focused on unemployment was enough to trigger federal investigation. In 1957, FBI agent Mark Felt, who would later become famous as the Watergate informant Deep Throat, wrote to Hoover expressing concern about Nat King Cole. This is particularly striking because Cole was hardly a radical figure. He had even performed at the Republican National Convention the year before in support of President Eisenhower. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the 1950s, any black entertainer with influence was viewed with suspicion. As rock and roll emerged in the mid-1950s, the FBI's attention naturally turned to this new musical form. Elvis Presley, the undisputed king of rock and roll, accumulated an FBI file of over 750 pages between 1956 and 1980. The surveillance began after concerned parents wrote letters to the FBI about Elvis's suggestive performances and their effect on teenagers. One FBI memo described Elvis as certainly not the type of individual whom the director would wish to meet, noting his long hair and exotic dress. The irony of Elvis's situation became clear in 1970 when he visited FBI headquarters, hoping to meet his hero J. Edgar Hoover and volunteer as an informant. Elvis genuinely believed in J. Edgar Hoover's anti-communist mission and wanted to help infiltrate the counterculture movement. He explained to FBI officials that his unconventional appearance was actually a tool that would help him reach anti-establishment youth and convince them of the error of their ways. Despite Elvis's enthusiasm, Hoover refused to meet with him, and the FBI continued to view the king with suspicion. The government's surveillance reached absurd heights with the investigation of Louie by the Kingsmen in 1963. After receiving complaints that the song contained obscene lyrics, the FBI launched a 31-month investigation involving repeated listening sessions at different speeds, interviews with the songwriter Richard Berry, and analysis by the FBI laboratory. The resulting 119-page report concluded that the song was unintelligible at any speed and found no evidence of obscenity. The investigation was eventually closed in 1965, though the FBI did miss the fact that drummer Lynn Easton had actually shouted "fuck" after fumbling a drum fill at 0:54 on the record. But it was the surveillance of John Lennon that would become the most documented and controversial case in FBI history. Lennon's troubles began in December 1971, shortly after he and Yoko Ono moved to New York. When Lennon performed at a rally for imprisoned White Panthers leader John Sinclair, FBI agents were in the audience taking notes. A memo from Senator Strom Thurmond to the Nixon White House had already flagged Lennon as a potential threat due to an upcoming tour that could influence young voters against Nixon's re-election. The FBI's 281-page file on Lennon reveals the extent of the surveillance operation. Agents monitored his phone calls, tracked his movements, and infiltrated his social circle. One memo from J. Edgar Hoover to the head of the Miami FBI office suggested that if Lennon could be arrested on narcotics charges, he would become more immediately deportable. The Immigration and Naturalization Service joined the campaign, delivering a letter to the Lennons on March 1, 1972, demanding they leave the country within 2 weeks or face deportation hearings, using Lennon's 1968 marijuana possession conviction as justification. The FBI files reveal the petty nature of much of the surveillance. Agents critiqued Lennon's music, with one informant dismissing a song about John Sinclair as lacking Lennon's usual standards and noting that Yoko Ono cannot even remain on key. Despite this extensive surveillance, the FBI found no evidence of criminal activity, and surveillance officially ended in August 1972. However, the deportation battle continued until July 1976, when Lennon finally received his green card. The tragic irony of the Lennon case became apparent after his murder on December 8, 1980. Historian John Wiener filed a Freedom of Information Act request for Lennon's FBI files shortly after his death, beginning a 14-year legal battle to obtain the documents. When the files were finally released, over 70% of the pages were withheld entirely, and much of what was released was heavily redacted. The government had spent enormous resources monitoring a musician they ultimately found guilty of nothing more than having political opinions. The surveillance state's attention wasn't limited to white rock stars. Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, was monitored by the FBI for 40 years, from 1967 to 2007. Her 270-page file, obtained by Rolling Stone in 2022, shows that agents tracked her addresses, phone numbers, and activities, particularly her association with civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and revolutionary activist Angela Davis. The FBI was especially concerned about her performances at political events, worried they might incite racial violence. Angela Davis herself was one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives in 1970, and her connections to black entertainers brought additional scrutiny to their activities. Jazz musicians faced particularly intense scrutiny throughout this period. Max Roach was visited by FBI agents at his Manhattan home in 1965 to question him about the Revolutionary Action Movement, and despite his denials of involvement, agents continued monitoring him until informants confirmed his story. Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker, and Charles Mingus all found themselves under surveillance. their files documenting everything from their political associations to their personal struggles with addiction. The government's approach to musician surveillance evolved with the times. During the jazz era, the focus was on drug use and alleged communist connections. The rock era brought concerns about anti-war sentiment and counterculture influence. But it was the emergence of hip-hop that would trigger the most explicit government hostility toward musicians since the persecution of Billie Holiday. On August 1st, 1989, the FBI agent Milt Allerich sent an unprecedented letter to Priority Records, distributors of N.W.A.'s debut album Straight Outta Compton, condemning the song "Fuck the Police." The letter claimed the song encourages violence against law enforcement and purported to represent the opinion of the entire law enforcement community. This was the first time the FBI had officially gone on record criticizing a specific song since the Louie investigation. The N.W.A. letter, now displayed at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, marked a new phase in government surveillance of musicians. The FBI began investigating hip-hop artists with the same intensity once reserved for communist sympathizers. Wu-Tang Clan faced a 5-year investigation from 1999 to 2004, with the FBI and NYPD collaborating to investigate the group for federal charges, including alleged connections to drug kingpins. The FBI gathered a 95-page file on the group and labeled them a major criminal organization, though no charges were ever filed. Even Tupac Shakur, despite his relatively brief career, accumulated extensive federal surveillance before his death in 1996, with reports suggesting ongoing FBI monitoring of his activities and associations. The surveillance was not limited to American artists. British intelligence agency N.W.A. maintained files on John Lennon starting in 1968, according to former M15 operative David Shaler. The file included a copy of the lyrics to Working Class Hero in Lennon's own handwriting, showing that international intelligence agencies were also tracking musicians they deemed threatening. One of the most disturbing aspects of this surveillance was the systematic targeting of treatment facilities. Musicians arrested on drug charges were often sent to the Federal Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, known as the Narcotics Farm. The facility treated hundreds of jazz musicians, including Red Rodney, Sonny Rollins, Chet Baker, Jackie McLean, and reportedly Ray Charles. While officially a treatment center, the facility served as a de facto prison for musicians whose only crime was often their addiction to substances that were legal for other patients when prescribed by doctors. The targeting of musicians was not just about individual surveillance. It was part of a broader strategy to control cultural influence. Government officials understood that musicians, particularly black musicians, held enormous sway over young people's attitudes toward authority, war, and social justice. By harassing, imprisoning, and silencing these voices, the government hoped to limit their ability to inspire resistance or challenge the status quo. Jimi Hendrix provides a clear example of how the surveillance apparatus worked. In 1969, after being charged with drug possession during a visit to Canada, Hendrix found himself under FBI scrutiny. His bandmates later claimed they were warned of the bust ahead of time and believed the drugs were planted. Whether or not that is true, the pattern was consistent. Musicians who challenged authority found themselves facing legal troubles that seemed to coincide suspiciously with their most provocative political statements. The destruction of files represents another troubling aspect of this story. Researcher Fred Leonard discovered that FBI files on seminal black artists Sam Cooke, Richie Havens, and Nina Simone have been destroyed. This loss of historical evidence makes it impossible to fully understand the scope of government surveillance, and raises questions about what other files have been permanently lost. The impact of this surveillance extended beyond the individual musicians targeted. The knowledge that the government was watching created a chilling effect throughout the music industry. Artists had to weigh their desire for political expression against the risk of government harassment, deportation, or imprisonment. Some chose silence. Others, like Lennon and Holiday, paid enormous personal costs for their refusal to be silenced. The techniques used against musicians were the same ones employed against civil rights leaders and anti-war activists: surveillance, infiltration, harassment, and character assassination. The government used drug laws as a weapon, knowing that many musicians struggling with addiction were vulnerable to prosecution. They used immigration law against foreign artists like Lennon. They used the threat of violence, as Holiday experienced when agents handcuffed her to her deathbed. The legacy of this surveillance continues today. In 2018, internal FBI documents revealed that the agency was still engaged in COINTELPRO-style surveillance of the Black Lives Matter movement, using a designation called Black Identity Extremists to justify monitoring activists protesting police brutality. The techniques may have evolved, but the fundamental approach, monitoring and disrupting movements for social change, remains consistent. Recent declassifications have provided new insights into the scope of government surveillance. Aretha Franklin's files, only released in 2022, show surveillance continuing well into the 21st century. These revelations suggest that the government's interest in monitoring musicians never truly ended. It simply adapted to new technologies and new forms of musical expression. The story of government surveillance of musicians reveals the intersection of art, politics, and power in American society. It shows how those in authority have consistently viewed popular music not as harmless entertainment, but as a potential threat to their control. From Billie Holiday's anti-lynching protests to N.W.A.'s police brutality critiques, musicians have always served as voices for the voiceless, and that role has made them targets. What makes this story particularly powerful is how it demonstrates the government's fear of cultural influence. Officials who could deploy armies and nuclear weapons were genuinely threatened by 3-minute songs and the people who performed them. They understood what many people today have forgotten, that music has the power to change minds, inspire action, and challenge authority in ways that political speeches and newspaper editorials cannot. The files also reveal the often personal and petty nature of this surveillance. FBI agents critiquing Yoko Ono's singing ability, or spending 31 months investigating a garage rock song, shows how the apparatus of national security was deployed for reasons that had little to do with actual threats to the country. Instead, they reflect the prejudices, fears, and political agendas of those in power. Most importantly, this history demonstrates the resilience of artistic expression in the face of government oppression. Despite decades of surveillance, harassment, and persecution, the musicians targeted by the FBI and the CIA continued creating, performing, and speaking truth to power. Lennon got his green card and returned to music. Holiday kept singing Strange Fruit until her death. Hip-hop artists continued challenging police brutality despite FBI investigations. The secret war on rock and roll ultimately failed because you cannot kill an idea with surveillance. You cannot silence a song with a file folder. The music that the government tried so hard to suppress has outlasted the officials who ordered the surveillance, and their efforts to control popular culture now serve mainly as historical curiosities that reveal more about their fears than about any actual threats. Today, as we stream music freely and artists speak openly about political issues on social media, it is worth remembering the price that previous generations paid for that freedom. The FBI files on musicians serve as a reminder that artistic expression has never been as free as we might assume, and that the tension between art and authority remains a defining feature of American culture. The declassified documents tell a story that is both uniquely American and universally human. The eternal struggle between those who seek to control culture and those who create it, between the power of the state and the power of a song to change the world.